That's Debatable is sponsored by MB&G. MB&G are specialists in the esoteric world of vehicle and furniture warranty insurance, delivering quite marvellous customer service, prompt claims payment, and a highly developed understanding of how to deliver these products in a way that is both compliant with the regulations and attractive to customers. To find out more, call Paul Smith, the Managing Director, on 07887 501 441. That's 07887 501 441. Morning, Ben, and welcome back to our listeners. Welcome back to our viewers. I hope everyone enjoyed our first episode last week, which was with people able to see us on YouTube, as well as able to hear us on various podcast platforms. So hopefully our viewership is going up, as well as our listenership.
Give the people what they want, as one colleague waspishly remarked.
Waspishly is the most of our colleagues have been mocking us, haven't they, incessantly, Ben? But we're okay with that. We're very comfortable with it. We got lots to cover today, lots to cover this morning, or whenever you're listening to it. We thought we'd start with a bit of self-referentiality. Very briefly, we had an excellent episode when we were just on podcast platforms about 3 weeks ago, and we asked various of our listeners to come in or to write into us with examples of classics and how they might be rewritten by AI to be more politically correct. This was in the context of Visit Britain's new inclusive language guide that it issued last year to its corporate partners, and we had a whole segment on that which people can go back and listen to. But one of our members wrote in, and it was a fantastic idea. She suggested that we look at Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, and this little extract from that, where Tiny Tim says, or rather, someone quotes Tiny Tim as saying, "He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." That's the original. We threw that into ChatGPT, and this is what we got. "He told me on our way home that he hoped people saw him in the place of worship because he had a disability, and it might be meaningful for them to remember during the holiday season who helped those with disabilities walk and gave sight to those who were blind." And I think ChatGPT may need some educating there, Ben, because it did say blind at the end, which is a problematic word. But I think that's an improvement, isn't it?
That reminds me of one of the things that Peter Hitchens does on Twitter that's absolutely excellent is whenever the Church of England puts out scripture from the Bible in a modern, various modern versions of the Bible the Church of England use, he will reply with the King James version every single time.
The authorized.
So I quite like that. Makes me laugh every time I see it. It does. that does capture it. I like brilliant. the I can't remember which AI it was now. It was one of the image generating ones, and they had to. Was it the Google one? I can't remember, Tom. And they had to take it down because people were asking it to generate pictures of Nazi soldiers, and it was coming back with incredibly ethnically diverse units of the Wehrmacht, which was
and Vikings who may have invaded Lindisfarne. Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Exactly.
Yeah, all good fun. Well, we want to talk.
So thank you to our listener for that. That was brilliant. But I thought we should launch into our first thought, really, Ben. I thought it would be good to start with you've just reached us from the trenches, haven't you? It's extremely busy at the Free Speech Union, and so we thought we'd give listeners and viewers a little bit of background as to what's going on here at HQ.
Yes. First of all, I want to quote an article from Time magazine published in 2019. "The problem with this perspective is cancel culture isn't real, at least not in the way people believe it is. Instead, it's turned into a catch-all for when people in power face consequences for their actions or receive any type of criticism, something that they're not used to." Now, that's the sort of rubbish, I think we could charitably term it, that was seen basically all over the place 4 or 5 years ago. That was the sort of response from certain left-wing papers when the Free Speech Union was launched back in 2020. And I think that is an example of the kind of argument that seems to have been largely retired now. You will still find it on Twitter, or X, formerly known as Twitter, and you will still have examples of people talking about its consequence culture and that kind of thing. But I do think the phenomenon has been so inescapably obvious now. And there have been so many landmarks on the way: the Forced Data case, the Cass review, the dozens and dozens of cases of ours that have been publicized over the years. And then, of course, there are the thousands of cases, and I mean that quite literally, not hyperbolically, the thousands of cases of ours that are never in the public domain. And we've racked up now 2,500 cases that the Free Speech Union has helped with over 4 years and 3 months or something. And I think now we're in the position where the data is so abundant and so clear, so incontrovertible, that it's worth reflecting actually on how vast this problem is. And one point I'll make just before handing over to you again, Tom, is to say that of those 2,500 people who've contacted the Free Speech Union and said something like, I think I'm about to be sacked because I've posted something about the trans debate on Twitter, or I've agreed with something J.K. Rowling has said on Instagram, God forbid. That, of course, is not a representative sample of what's happening across the whole country. That is only the figure for people who have heard of the Free Speech Union already, who are members of ours already, or who hear of us and then sign up when they need our help. Or, people who've got friends who've heard of us and refer people on. And so it must surely be the case that the problem is even more vast than that. So that 2,500 figure is the low ball, really. Those are just the ones we know about.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Ben. And we've done some research, haven't we? We did a survey of the workplace in the UK, which proved, or certainly indicated — you can't with surveys prove things, but you can certainly indicate things very, very strongly — that there is a problem, that what we see is the tip of the iceberg. And in the workplace, the level of self-censorship — I can't remember the exact stat, I think it might have been sort of 62% have in some way self-censored themselves in the workplace, normally in the context of some equity, diversity, inclusion, or indeed climate training. And that report is actually up on our website and was really shocking. And I think we said that even Free Speech Union staff, when we presented those results, there was a collective intake of breath. But as I was preparing for today, Ben, I went back to a book called Free Speech: A Global History from Socrates to Social Media, which you may well be familiar with, by Jacob Mshangama. And in that book, he comes up with the idea, or he mentions the idea, of entropy, which is obviously from thermodynamics, about how a system tends towards a state of disorder or increasing disorder. And he mentions in that book, and this is a quote from the book, almost invariably, the introduction of free speech into a society, a democracy, or wherever, whichever society it is in history, introduction of free speech sets in motion a process of entropy. The leaders of any political system, no matter how enlightened, inevitably convince themselves that now, freedom of speech has gone too far. And that quote you opened with, when sort of talking about what we see at the Free Speech Union, that quote you opened with, which is cancel culture is a myth, is a version of freedom of speech has gone too far. We're in a moment where freedom of speech is not the answer, is what leaders say. And I guess it's not just political leaders, it's cultural leaders, it's commentators, it's influential journalists, all of whom, from their position of, I'm going to use the word privilege in the sort of traditional sense of it, but in their tradition of in their position of privilege are able to say, I feel threatened at the moment by the exercising of free speech. If I'm a boss in a workplace, or if I'm an activist or whatever, I feel threatened by the imposition of free speech. And so now is the moment for us to clamp down on it. And I think that's in many ways what we've seen, just this process of entropy. I really like that idea that Jacob brings into his book, actually. So that was another thought I had as to what we may be seeing. But I mean, also, you're just so busy, aren't you, Ben? That's what people don't realize. You're just swept off your feet at the moment.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the scale, as I've said, the scale of the problem over the last 4 years has been even more vast than what we have already measured it to be. But I think one of the sort of theories that I have in my mind is the idea of censorship as relating to social and economic fragility, i.e., you have a model of society that is not very sure of itself, is very fragile, and therefore requires a higher degree of censorship to hold that together. So the classic example would be any kind of multinational, multi-ethnic empire that is unlikely to be a place where you have unfettered freedom of speech for obvious reasons, because you've got national minorities who basically need to be kept suppressed by the imperial centre. And I think in Britain today, we've spoken in previous episodes about this idea of modern Britain as being like a kind of domestic empire where you've got lots of different identity, race and ethnic, religious groups, gender-based and sexuality-based identity groups as well, and so on, who all have these competing sectional interests through the prism of identity politics, who all basically need to be kept in check somehow. And the most effective way to do that seems to be basically shutting everybody else up. And so that's why we have a corporate world and a public sector alike that are so anxious to pump equality, diversity, and inclusion training into a workforce that we've seen from our own evidence is unwilling to have that type of training. I think people are willing to think about the ways in which people are different and not to be discriminatory towards each other. I think that's fine. I don't think there's any body of opinion that would reject that, really. But it takes this censorious form because there is such a sense, I think, of fragility about modern Britain, of wobbliness, of shakiness. And we see this in Lord Walney's report, for instance, on blasphemy cases that we've seen about the grammar school and so on. Dame Sarah Khan's report on the same subject. There is this profound anxiety about any free expression of views which is deemed to be negative or critical of Islam. We've been very involved in a number of cases protecting the rights of people actually to express their perfectly lawful views about religion and about Islam particularly. And of course, there is the immense shakiness of the trans project because, in my view, I imagine in the view of all of our listeners and viewers, it's entirely unscientific and disconnected from the facts. That's not to say that you can't say live and let live, but when your claims begin to conflict with the right and, frankly, the reality of the rest of us, then of course there is an issue there. And so that's why that project has been so censorious. That's why censorship is an intrinsic part of trans ideology, and why the mantra has been no debate, because it's so shaky, it's so unsound, unsafe and wobbly, that the only way of projecting and protecting that ideology is to make sure that it can't be criticized. So I think those two things are very, very closely related.
The debate is over, which is a phrase I haven't actually heard in recent months in ways that perhaps I was hearing it 4 or 5 years ago. There have been subtle shifts in the cultural sands. The debate is over. I think people have realized we're not falling for that one again. The debate isn't over. In fact, in many of these cases, the debate never took place. And actually, just to quote Jacob Mchangama again, and his excellent book, Free Speech, A Global History from Socrates to Social Media. I'm not sponsored by him, by the way, but just a quote from he ends the book with a quote from Orwell, which I think relates in an interesting way to what you're saying about the sort of the holding together of different groups that are in tension, and the way in which actually we can from a sort of ground up, we can fight this. So George Orwell says, if large numbers of people are interested in freedom of speech, there will be freedom of speech, even if the law forbids it, even if the police come and arrest you and your boss tells you don't have it. However, on the flip side, if public opinion is sluggish, inconvenient minorities will be persecuted, even if laws exist to protect them. So it comes down to how watchful we are. It comes down to how we decide to live our own lives, really. And if enough of us say we're going to make sure we have free speech, then from a ground up perspective, there's hope. And so Orwell, as well as obviously pulling the curtain back and revealing society as it was and as it is, at the same time says, look, there is a way through this. There is hope. And it lies, interestingly, of course, if it is freedom of speech, it has to lie with the individuals working together and convincing themselves together that free speech must be allowed to thrive, must be allowed to exist.
Yeah, I mean, Britain is not a country that's gone through a reformation in the last 5 years and is now populated with enthusiastic proponents of the new faith. I would say it's a country that is profoundly demoralized and trying to cling basically to its old ways, but in which the commanding heights of culture and indeed the actual economy, government, civil service, and so on, the judiciary, have been captured by people who are enthusiastic proponents of the Reformation, or who are at least people who've recognised that their preferment, their promotion, their life chances, and their career success depend on going with the flow and pretending that they are active proponents of the new replacement religion of woke, or whatever you want to call it. And there is this sort of preference falsification that's had to filter down throughout lower levels of society where people are. I mean, for instance, if you're an academic, it has been the case for many years at many elite institutions that you will have to provide an equality, diversity, and inclusion statement if you're applying for a job, or that there will be some kind of EDI requirement if you're applying for a promotion, or that you will have to show that you are committed to decolonizing your course. So if you're an expert in 18th century continental European history, or if you're an expert in Shakespeare, or you're an expert in 17th century music, or whatever, it's obviously going to be quite difficult to decolonize your course. And that's not to say that curriculums can't be broadened if there's a demand for that, but it's not that. It's not people saying we ought to do this as well, which is an argument I think lots of people be receptive to. Actually, it's saying you must not teach the old stuff. Basically, you must only teach this. There must be only this flavor available, and I think that's what people reject. I think the British people, we're an open-minded bunch, actually, but it's that dogmatic way of enforcing the preferences of a very small number of people and the rest of us that people reject.
Well, sticking on a theme that is related to all of these big trends, these big free expression trends, something that caught my eye this week, Ben, is the latest Global Expression Report for 2024. It was published this week and reported in The Guardian, actually, published by Article 19, who do this survey. And I think they do this survey annually. And speaking as a data person, as a sort of statistical person, I rather like the fact that they've actually done it now over at least a decade, because we can look at the trends over time. And like a lot of these surveys, what's really interesting is to look at the trends over time. So what Article 19 have done, they select 25 indicators from the varieties of democracy data set that best match their view of freedom of expression. And those indicators include items such as freedom from internet censorship efforts, freedom of discussion for both men and women, freedom of academic and cultural expression, transparent laws with predictable enforcement, freedom of religion. So really quite good subjects, good subtitles that they look at and they track over time. But what's dispiriting about this, and this isn't just the UK, this is the whole world, is that they saw a sharp rise in the number of people categorized as living in a crisis sort of scoring, crisis for freedom of speech and information. And that went up in 1 year from 34% to 53%. Now, that sounds absolutely ghastly. How do so many people go into a crisis bucket for freedom of expression? And it would seem most of that arises from the reclassification of India into the crisis category. So like all these things, you have to scratch under the surface and say, how in 1 year can it jump that much from 34% to 53%? But the classification of a huge country like India suddenly moves a billion people into a worse category. So it's slightly, you have to treat it with a bit of caution. However, the overall trend, as the director Quinn McHugh says, is not good. And he pulls the lens back and looks at the last 20 years. And a quote from him, he says that at no point in the last 20 years have so many people been denied the benefits of open societies, like the ability to voice opinions, access a free media, or participate in free and open elections. So that's Article 19's Executive Director Quinn McHugh. And I went in and had a look at the data. It's a great little report, and it's a nice graphs that they put onto the website. You can go in and you can dig down into every country. Surprise, surprise, I went and had a look at the UK, and we're 33rd in the league table, which is okay. We are still in the open category, which is for a score between 80 and 100. And our score, though, Ben, is just 81. But if we went back 10 years, we went back to 2013, I think it is, we had a score of 87. Now, that's 6-point reduction, but that moves us from safely in the open category to very much on the edge between the open category and the less restricted. There are 3 categories in the middle, highly restricted, restricted, and less restricted. And we're in danger if that trend continues as the UK of going from being open category into less restricted. And just my last point, so that was the UK, not a great trend, I think, over 10 years. But the worst case in Europe was actually Poland. They've gone down 27 points. They were at 92, so well above where we are now, open about 10 years ago, to 65, well into the territory of less restricted. And North Macedonia is the one in Europe that's gone up the most. So there's a lot going on in this analysis. There's a lot of interesting data in this analysis. I think it's most useful to look over a 10-year period rather than over a 1-year period because of the distortions of moving one country like India. But Ben, that is not a very optimistic view as to what the direction of travel is at all, is it?
Well, while you've been talking, Tom, I've just been looking at some individual countries. What's going on in the Gambia? They've gone up 63 points. I want whatever they're having.
They're right at the top, aren't they? They're the biggest. So there's a decliner on the one hand, and then there's those that have got much better on the other. But I think the issue as well is that over the last decade, 6.2 billion people across 78 countries experienced a deterioration of their freedom of expression, whereas only 303 million or 0.3 billion people across 18 countries, including the Gambia, saw improvement. So the improvers are few in number, whereas the decliners are far more in number.
I have to admit my knowledge of domestic politics in the Gambia is not what it might be.
It's not what it was.
But I will be doing research to see what it is they are doing right that we are doing wrong.
Yes.
And if there are lessons to learn, Yeah, this is very interesting.
Doing very well. They're top of the list at 95. Okay, so we all need to get to Copenhagen as quickly as possible. Okay. Which is interesting, Waitley, where Jacob Mashangama is from. He's from Copenhagen. Goodness me, there's a link there. But yeah, it's those longer term trends. They link in with a lot of what you're saying, Ben, about governments and I think a lot of it's social media as well, and how governments are trying to cope with social media and manage it. And I think they are falling into the trap of saying free speech can go by the wayside.
This is quite a useful tool if you're planning to flee the country for any particular reason in the next 6 weeks. To find a safe harbor.
What are you saying, Ben?
Yes, okay, interesting. So I might be broadcasting from Fiji next time, who are also an improver.
You're not just looking at free expression elements here, are you, Ben? You're also looking at lifestyle and sun.
Yeah, there's a couple of tabs open on my computer right now, to be honest with you, Tom. One of them is this report, and one of them is weather forecast in these various countries. Yeah, okay, that's interesting. That is interesting. I'm going to find out what's going on in the Gambia. That would be my research project.
Well, I think these reports are very, very important. I do think they throw light on what's going on around the world, and they put us in the UK into context in quite an important way. And let's take the optimistic side to this. Yes, we're a decliner. Yes, we're falling to the bottom of the range for being an open society, according to this analysis. All of this is obviously qualified by according to this analysis. Any analysis can be flawed, but it can be tracked over time. And as long as methodologies stay relatively consistent, I think it's a really useful thing and a really useful analysis. We are, nevertheless, despite all of what you deal with every day, Ben, in the case team and the number of cases we've seen, we are still an open society when it comes to freedom of expression. And maybe for some people that's a surprise. Maybe for some people it would be a surprise if we weren't.
I've not looked into the methodology of the report, Tom. I assume this is looking at censorship by and from the state. So
it is most of the indicators. So these 25 indicators that it covers, most of them are looking at things that would be controlled by the state. I mean, the categories themselves don't necessarily mean they're necessarily controlled by the state. But if you look at the detail, most of it talks about state-sponsored public authorities. Okay. Those words recur. Government. I'm looking at it right now. The state, the government.
What I'm driving at, though, it doesn't then perhaps capture situations like the sort of bread and butter stuff we're dealing with, where somebody has been, dismissed by their employer, say, or expelled by their university because of their beliefs. So it will capture cases where the police bash your door down because you've been putting up mild gender critical stickers up on lampposts. It will capture that, but it won't capture people being sacked by their employer.
It might. So there's for example, one category is freedom of academic exchange, and as I look at that, and the scale on that, the worst is completely restricted. Academic exchange and dissemination is, across all disciplines, consistently subject to censorship, self-censorship, or other restrictions. So, the state is not mentioned there. It simply mentions the whole area of academic exchange. Similarly, laws and their application, elites abuse the legal system is mentioned. So it is broader than just, although state, government, public authorities, local authorities is mentioned in these 25 variables, it's not exclusive. And of course, then it's a question of how much they're weighted.
Yeah, so it's not to detract from the value of assessing global trends and trends within countries in terms of what the state is doing. But as we see, actually, the main issue that we're dealing with, by and large, is not censorship from the state, although there is plenty of that, and there's a growing amount of it. It tends to be from employers, or indeed universities.
And I think that's a really important observation that we talk about. I think you said this in a podcast, actually, that if we were to go back in a time machine and talk to people from the 1970s about where is suppression of freedom of expression coming from, at that time, the expectation on all sides of the political spectrum would be, in some way, the state, because the state, and talk about Orwell, for example, he would have probably have said state machinery is where the suppression will come from, in whatever way. The reality, as you say, that we see is that it comes from businesses, the corporate world, and all of the layers between your front door all the way up to the front door of number 10, all layers that take you from one to the other in some way are playing their part, aren't they, in the current censorship world?
I think the disconcerting thing for members of the Free Speech Union who are on the left of politics, and I've had lots and lots of conversations with people on the left or centre left who've needed our help over the years, and they've kind of had to go through a process of realising, or some of them did, in fairness, did realise this already, but of accepting that free speech is now largely being defended from the centre right. And for those of us on the right or centre right of politics, we've had to go through this disconcerting process of realising that free markets, in fact, do not guarantee free people, and that so much of the threat, in fact, is coming from the private sector. Yeah. So both left and right, both parts of the left and right who united on protecting free speech, and we do have a very impressive coalition of people involved in this struggle. But each side of that, each component part of that, have had to go through a disconcerting process of kind of realizing that some of our core beliefs actually are not panning out in the way that we expected them to.
I think that's a very well-made point, Ben. Yeah, that's why the coalition has come into being, isn't it? Is because there's been a realization of the different elements of the attack of free speech, depending on the left or the right, and how they've played out. One more item, I think, for today, Ben, is there was a very interesting article written in Spiked by a founding director of the Free Speech Union, a member of our advisory council, and also more recently founder of the Equinano project. And it's Inaya Falarin Iman, and she's talking about hate speech laws. And she's referring in her article in Spiked to a Channel 4 News piece that asked whether hate speech laws are being weaponized against ethnic minority Britons. And so in this piece, they're talking about how, actually different groups, going back to the idea of different subgroups in our society, are now using hate speech laws against other ethnic minority groups. The obvious example is in this piece that Channel 4 put together is Maria Hussein, who's under investigation for hate speech for holding a placard up at a Palestine protest depicting the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and then Home Secretary Suella Braverman as coconuts under a tree. And she's being investigated under hate speech or hate crime laws for that. So it's kind of one, and she is herself an ethnic minority. So the Channel 4 piece is arguing that this is wrong in some sense. It's being weaponized, these hate speech laws. And what Inaya draws attention to is, well, at no point does the piece actually address the question of whether we should even have these hate speech laws at all. And this is the problem. It's saying they're being used in the wrong way, or suggesting that they're being used and applied in the wrong way and in an unfair way and an non-even-handed way. And that maybe that's right. I don't know. But her point is that's not the point. The point is that we should be asking ourselves, do we even want these laws? And obviously Inaya, because she was a founding director of the Free Speech Union, her point is no, we don't. And so I think that here we go. She says that if you call for censorship of so-called hate speech, it will eventually be used against you. After all, different people will be in power at different times, and our understanding of hate constantly changes. So I thought it'd be worth drawing attention to that article and this issue of hate speech and hate crime. And one thing I thought, Ben, just before I hand back over to you, is that how quickly our language how these ideas and these concepts have come into our everyday language. I went back to the mid-90s and I said to someone, what do you think we mean by hate speech? What do you think we mean by hate law? I think the answer we'd get is, oh, you're talking about 1984 George Orwell. We're in England, we're in the UK, we live in a free country, so that's not something we need to worry about. Hate law, hate speech, hate crime, those things are not concepts which we need to worry about here. Well, how things have changed, how the mighty have fallen, to quote the Bible.
My view of this, it goes back to some of what we were talking about earlier, which is that managing a multicultural state is very, very hard. And I don't know if it's possible to do that without a state becoming very authoritarian. And I don't know if we're at the peak of that now, or if the peak of it lies in the future. On more pessimistic days, I think I'd probably tend towards the latter view. And the difference, of course, between speaking to if we went on time machine and were speaking to somebody from the 1990s about this, is that we have now completely transitioned from a state in which people were dealt with as individual, I don't like the word citizens, but individual citizens, to a state now where people are engaged with in so many ways as being part of an identity group. And that doesn't necessarily have to be an ethnic minority, although often it is. But as we were talking about, it could be a sex or gender or sexuality based minority. And if you have a country like that, and if you're committed to managing the state in that way, the last thing you need is people stirring up, and that's of course the language we see so often now in legislation, stirring up hatred between different groups, because then you're dealing with race riots. And so I think the logic of the country that has been built in the last 30 years puts us on this propulsive course towards becoming more authoritarian by default. And so that's what we have to all be aware of. That's what the Free Speech Union is campaigning against. None of us want that to happen. And to put, to introduce an element of optimism into what is otherwise quite a gloomy analysis, as I said, I think the overwhelming majority of the British public, white or non-white, do not want an authoritarian future and are quite happy getting along with people from different backgrounds, so long as there is a basic respect for what is called in bureaucracy and in schools and so on British values, one of which ought to be respect for freedom of expression.
It's a good opportunity there, Ben, to plug two organisations that we actually point members towards. The first is indeed Inaya's organisation, the Equiano Project, which was founded in August 2020. And that's a debate, discussion and ideas forum which facilitates conversations about and promotes the values of freedom, common humanity, and universalism. So that's Inaya's organization. But we also refer people on to Don't Divide Us, which I'm sure many viewers and listeners will be aware of. And again, that came together in the summer of 2020. A lot happened in the summer of 2020. And someone we mentioned, a friend of the Free Speech Union, Alka Segal Cuthbert, often speaks on behalf of Don't Divide Us. They've done some excellent reports and work on an alternative view of race to the anti-racism view that we've heard, and that has integrated, sort of infected and found its roots in the corporate world. There are alternative, traditional Martin Luther King ways of looking at the problem of racism. So I think those are two organizations, and these grassroots organizations are so important, and the reports that they write and the analysis they do, the surveying they do, the coalitions they create actually are part of this fight back. So yes, the hardest fights may be in the future, Ben, but thank goodness for these organizations, and we certainly are grateful for them in the Free Speech Union. We're grateful that we can point people on who are in these pickles at times and say, some great resources, some great touch points for you with these other organizations. But yeah, I think that's probably all we need to speak about for this week, Ben. Anything you wanted to add?
No, I don't think so. We'll see you next time, or you will see us if you can bear to, or listen to us if not. And thank you for joining us, however you have done so.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.